stitch. Hey oh hey ya hey ya. Hey oh hey ya hey ya. Hey hi oh. Hey okay, hello, dance, Danny, Dada, Bustich, hey, oh, hey, hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, oh, hey, hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, okay, hello, dance, Danny, Dada, Bustich, hey, oh, hey, hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, oh, hey, hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, oh, hey, hey,
Siksikaitsitapiiks. Nitawanok Enki. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park's episode of the history of firewater and the Siksikaitsitapiiks. And in English, Siksikaitsitapiiks means Blackfoot speaking peoples. So this is our history when it comes to alcohol and how it was introduced to us and how it affected our people. And so we talked about this particular subject on previous episodes, and here in 2025 we're going to finish up some of those episodes and lead you on to some new stories in our future webinar broadcasts. But in the meantime, I want to welcome you once again. In English, my name is Grant Manyheads. I am one of the interpreters here at Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park. In Blackfoot, I said my name was Enki, and that actually means singer when you translate it into the Blackfoot language into the English. So from here, we'll move on to our first episode, so to speak, in 2025 on the history of firewater and the Siksikaitsitapiiks. And basically, this is a revision of some of the past episodes that we had. So from here, let's actually move on to our first image. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, this is the Blackfoot Confederacy image. It's actually a legal entity here in Canada, and there actually is a Blackfoot Confederacy legal entity in the United States of America. But the Blackfoot-speaking people are neither Canadian nor American. We are Blackfoot. We are Siksikaitsitapiiks. And this is our symbol. So today on the North American continent, there are actually 4 nations that make up the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, are the Siksikaitsitapiiks. And we'll actually go through those first, because this episode is actually based on these people today. And that's my people, the Siksikaitsitapiiks. So let's move on to the next image. And here we have all 4 of our nation's tribal flags. So you can see that all of them are represented. We have the Siksika up in the corner. We have the Agena. Agena are the blood tribe. And then we have the Piikani. And the 3 flags up top in this picture are actually all in Canada. And the bottom flag there is actually in the United States of America. And those are the people that we call Amskapi Piikani, meaning those people living across the border, across the line. And those people are actually also members of our confederacy. So let's move on to the next image. Now here we have the Piikani flag all by itself, and we can probably go through here pretty quick. Let's just take a look at the 4 flags of the 4 Blackfoot tribes today. Now this one here is, like we mentioned, this is the Piikani. Our people know them as the Pagan, but they naturally are the Piikani. The next image is the Siksika. So here the Siksika, actually when it translates into English, it means Blackfoot. So we're the first tribe to actually meet with the quote-unquote white man. So this is the Siksika flag. They're the farthest north and east of all the Blackfoot tribes. The next image. Here's our sister tribe, the Agena. They're known as the blood tribe, and they have the largest reservation here in Canada by land. And this tribe here used to also be known as the Apate, or they're still known as the, I'm not even sure if I'm saying it right, and if any of my viewers hear my words and wish to correct me, feel free to call in and do so, because the honest truth is I'm still learning my language as we go along, and there's a lot of new words that are coming at us. So, but I think you'd say Siksikaitsitapiiks. Siksikaitsitapiiks. I'll get it right. But it basically translates to the white weasel pelt people, because these people were known by other tribes, particularly other Blackfoot tribes, as those people who wear those white ermine skins or the white weasel skins. And they had a lot of those white weasel skins on their clothes, which was a special thing because not just anybody could wear white weasel skins. You had to have the rights to it. So there was a lot of people who had the rights to it living in this particular tribe. And these were regarding a lot of spiritual matters and things things as such that most outsiders would not understand. But this is the blood tribe, the Agena. And so if we move on to the next image, here we have the tribe, like I mentioned, that lives in the United States of America. The Americans actually call them Blackfeet, but that's a misnomer because there are no Blackfeet tribes. There's a Blackfoot tribe, as I mentioned, and that's where we're broadcasting from, the Siksika people. But the Amskapi Pikani, as they properly should be known, are actually pagan. That's the term that they apply to their northern cousins. Well, that's the name that they call them down in the United States of America. But more properly, amongst the Blackfoot people, we call our cousins Amskapi Pikani, because Amskapi means across the border. And you have to understand that border is a new thing to the Blackfoot people. It didn't exist throughout most of our existence up until the 18th century. And then when the border was put in along the 49th parallel, that effectively divided the Blackfoot. So anyways, let's move on to the next image. And here we see all 4 tribes flags that exist today on the North American continent. And together we're known as the Siksikaitsitapiiks. And as I mentioned earlier, in our language, that basically translates to Blackfoot speaking peoples. So this is who our present day story is about when we talk about the history of Firewater and the Siksikaitsitapiiks. So let's actually move on to our next image. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with what the Blackfoot considered our homeland, this is a good map that represents that. Now, there were no true borders, but our people used to wander those lands that the buffalo wandered. In my language, we call the buffalo ini. So wherever that animal roamed on the northern plains, my people followed them. And this goes back into antiquity, literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. My people have been on these lands. And since our existence, up until the time that that animal almost went extinct or was extirpated, my people were buffalo people. And so wherever that animal wandered, we followed them. And in fact, in our language, there's a word we would say, nitawasani, that we are the people of the land of the buffalo. So even the Blackfoot don't acknowledge that this land is ours. This is the land of the buffalo. And because of our special relationship with that animal, we simply are those people who live with the buffalo on the buffalo lands. So here we see all the lands of the Blackfoot speaking peoples. Now our lands were vast before pre-contact. Now, right from the Rocky Mountains, or what people know as the Rocky Mountains today, my people, we call that Mistakists, or that's the backbone of the earth. So from the backbone of the earth, all the way east, out to almost Manitoba, to the Manitoba Escarpment, the Qu'Appelle Valley, the Touchwood Hills, the Nut Mountain, the Little Touchwood Hills, all of these areas east, my people used to live. We used to camp in these areas, following the buffalo herds. As far north as the North Saskatchewan River, near present-day Edmonton, Rocky Mountain House, Batoche, and Prince Albert. From that river all the way south to the Yellowstone River. All the lands in between are what my Blackfoot people call Kitawas, our homeland. And so this is the people where our people would live. This is where we had our sacred sites. This is where many of our origin stories came from, all these lands. And so this is how our people know our lands intimately. We knew where to forage for plants, edible plants, medicines. We used to find lodgepole pine in certain parts of our land. We knew where to find good sources of water. We knew where the bad sources of water, the alkali lakes, all the just so much. Our people it was actually just like a big grocery store to us. We knew where to find anything that we needed to thrive out here on the plains. So this huge area, like I mentioned, was where we lived, and we hunted the buffalo, because to the Blackfoot people, we've been buffalo people always. Unlike other tribes who migrated onto the plains and had to learn how to live off the plains, well, they had to have copied those tribes that were already here. And the Blackfoot-speaking peoples are one of those tribes. Archaeological evidence actually supports much of our claims to being out here forever. The first people out here. So let's actually move on to the next image. Now, we've been talking about the whiskey trade and how whiskey was introduced to us through the British and the French, because these are the first white men that we met. And in their trade, because the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company were both in competition with each other, and the Northwest Company, coming from eastern parts of Canada, particularly along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, they were using alcohol, liquor, to entice the natives into the trade relationships. They'd get them drunk and get them feeling good, and then they'd have trade, and then they'd trade maybe a little bit of the liquor, but it wasn't huge barrels or anything like that. In fact, in those days, most of the gifts to the Indians of liquor were all they were. It amounted to gifts. There was no more alcohol that was plied with the natives. Well, this is how it was introduced to our native peoples, and then they started associating the trading posts with liquor. Now, for the Blackfoot people, we didn't start trading with the British and the French until 1786, and this is when liquor was introduced to us as a regular commodity. And through that time, even then, it was controlled somewhat. The Blackfoot only went to the trading posts maybe once or twice a year. So maybe once or twice a year they can enjoy that excess liquor coming from the British and French. And even then, a lot of the liquor coming from the British and French were high wines. They were good brandy. They were good wine. They were good whiskey. And it was the same liquor that the white people were drinking that we were drinking, only watered down somewhat. So it wasn't poisonous to us. It was given to us in smaller quantities. Well, that changed when the American Fur Company became involved in the trade. It wasn't until 1831 that the Blackfoot actually started trading with the Americans, because up until that time, because of the Lewis and Clark expedition, on that particular expedition, as the Americans were exploring the Louisiana Purchase, as they called it, when Napoleon sold that land to the Americans, well, then they started to explore it. And in 1804 to 1806, the Lewis and Clark expedition went through Blackfoot lands, went to the Pacific, but on their way back, they came back through those same Blackfoot lands and they encountered some Piikani. And what ended up was 2 Piikani were killed by the Lewis and Clark expedition. They made it sound like it was the Piikani who were trying to steal horses, but the Piikani have an entirely different story, and I believe them as opposed to the Americans. I think they were mistakenly believing that these horses were going to be stolen, and so they killed these 2 Indians, these 2 Blackfoot braves. Well, what ended up happening was it caused this state of warfare to exist between the Blackfoot-speaking peoples and the Americans. So this existed right up until about 1830, when Culbertson, with the American Fur Company, sent a man named Jacob Berger, who was married to a Piikani woman, and sent him into the Blackfoot lands. They weren't expecting him to come back. They thought that was a suicide mission. They thought he was going to die, get killed by the Blackfoot. And it turns out that come the next spring, he came back with a bunch of Blackfoot coming willing to trade with the American Fur Company. Now at that time, this is when the American Fur Company trade started. And then there was this great rivalry between the Hudson Bay Company and the American Fur Company when they're vying for Blackfoot hides. And that's what the fur trade was all about. It was the hides. And the one way that they traded with the Blackfoot was to entice them by offering them liquor for cheap. But let's actually move on to the next image. Now the thing is, after Fort Union was formed in 1831, well, the traders wanted to get closer to the Blackfoot people, so they moved farther upstream the Missouri River. And as they did they came to a place called, well, I'm not familiar with what it's called then, but now I know it's known as the Brule Bottoms. But this is where they built Fort McKenzie. Now, Fort McKenzie was actually an American Fur Company post that existed for about maybe 14 or 15 years. And this was closer to the Blackfoot country. But the other tribes around that area at that time thought that the Americans were maybe unfairly dealing with the Blackfoot more as opposed to their tribes. And so on this one particular day, like you see in the picture, these are the Cree and the Assiniboine who decided to attack the Blackfoot that were camped near Fort Mackenzie at that time. There was a lot of death that happened on the part of the Blackfoot. And in fact, a lot of the Blackfoot that were camped there were drunk. A lot of them were just totally drunk. They were hammered, smashed, and they couldn't defend themselves. And so they tried their best. But if it wasn't for other Blackfoot camps around that fort that came to their rescue, these people would have been wiped out by the Cree and the Assiniboine. But as it turned out, a lot of them were saved, and even the people in the fort helped some of the families there. So that increased the trust between the Blackfoot and the Americans. So the Blackfoot continued to trade with the Americans at this point, right on the Missouri, kind of near, closer to the Blackfoot lands as opposed to Fort Union. Now, over time, this trade that happened at Fort Mackenzie, it became the scenes of a lot of violence, just a lot of chaos. Now, like the British forts, our people used to go there to trade once or two times a year, tops. They would trade at these forts. And the British and the French, they stayed on the North Saskatchewan. They didn't venture out onto the Blackfoot territory to trade. They stayed where they were at, and the Blackfoot would come to visit them once or twice a year. So the Europeans and the white men were not disruptive to our way of life. We still continued to hunt the buffalo and do the things that we always did for literally thousands of years. Now the Americans are a little bit different. They start moving into the Blackfoot lands. And Fort Mackenzie was one of these places. And unfortunately, the problems that plagued the British and the French forts plagued the American forts. For 2 years out of the year, the Blackfoot would gather at these forts and they would trade their trade goods. But usually there was a lot of alcohol that was given out at first as gifts. And times had changed. This was no longer older men and responsible adults having a sip of the whiskey. This was now young people who had no thought for the future, and these are the ones who were buying the whiskey, bringing in the hides, and these people would get drunk, and sometimes even just on a slight offense, somebody was murdered. So these were really bad times for the Blackfoot people as the trade started to come more and more into our territory, particularly coming from the States. So let's move on to the next image. Now here we have another map of the Blackfoot territory, and you can see right at the northern part, at the very top part of our territory, you can see the British and the French trading forts. And like I mentioned, they were far enough from our hunting grounds that they didn't disrupt our way of life. We actually went up to the forts, and then we'd go back to our lands and hunt the buffalo like we always did. And the British and the French would stay up on the North Saskatchewan. Well, as I mentioned there, you can see at the bottom, here's Fort Union at the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri River, and then the Americans start to move inland. And they built Fort Mackenzie, and eventually they built Fort Benton. So let's move on to the next image. Now, like you could see from the previous map that we looked at, now the Blackfoot have two choices if you want to trade. You can go north to the British and the French, or you can go south to the Americans. And because of this unique position that the Blackfoot were in, we were able to play off both of the competitors, the Americans and the British, where they would offer more and more goods to entice the Blackfoot to come to their post to trade. So here we have the American Fur Company, and this was a trade route. This is the way they came up the Missouri River. So if you see that map there, you can kind of see the slow progression from around the 18th century, from the time of Lewis and Clark, coming up the Missouri River, making their way north then west into the Blackfoot lands. The Americans learned the same as the British and the French, that the prime buffalo hides were all in the Blackfoot territory. And in fact, most of the other animals that they sought after for their fur trade were still in abundance in Blackfoot lands. And that's because the Blackfoot people, our belief and what we thought of the animals more as equals, not as pets, are beings less than us, but as equals, sharing our land with us. our people weren't inclined to slaughter these animals, not like other tribes did for the fur trade companies. So let's actually move on to the next image. So for a period of time there, from about 1831 up until about 1865, the Hudson Bay Company, which was the predominant fur company on the plains in North America, was now having to compete with the newly formed American Fur Company, who are operating right at the edge of Blackfoot lands. So like I mentioned, because of this rivalry, the Blackfoot were able to kind of take advantage of some of this competition. Now, the interesting note is that the American Fur Company were actually made up of a lot of traders who worked for the Northwest Company in Canada, which actually folded and joined with the Hudson Bay Company. Well, a lot of those people who weren't happy with that particular merger, they joined the Americans, and they're the ones who modeled the American Fur Company trade after the British, and that's why they were successful. Because previous to that, most of the American attempts to trade with the Blackfoot were unsuccessful, and a lot of them ended in death and violence. So let's move on to the next image. Now this liquor trade, its effects on the Blackfoot-speaking peoples at first wasn't very disruptive to the Blackfoot-speaking people's lifestyle. Now we were still hunting buffalo, as I mentioned, and with the British and the French, we went to their posts twice a year to trade. And maybe once or twice a year, some people would go on a bender, go on a spree. Maybe they'd get drunk for 2 or 3 days. But then after they were done drinking, they would do some serious trading, bring their robes in, bring in their peltries for trade goods. And this would last for that long, and then the people would go back to their homelands, where it is that they would hunt, where they usually lived, where they usually wintered. And in fact, most of the visits to the trading posts were just before the winter, so the people could get the provisions they need to survive that winter, the hunting goods, etc. So the liquor trade, it wasn't really disruptive to the Blackfoot people at this point. And in fact, when the American Fur Company first started trading in the manner of the British and the French, it was the same way. Our people would go visit the American Fur Companies maybe once or twice a year to trade our peltries, our goods. And this was basically how it happened right up until about 1865, where things changed. And because in 1865, this is when the American Fur Company actually dissolved. And in 1862, the Hudson Bay Company ceased using liquor as a commodity. So they weren't trading it or giving it out as gifts. So this very much affected Blackfoot-speaking peoples. But let's move on to the next image. Now here we're talking about great changes, and this is about 1850. Now in 1850, that's when Fort Benton actually opened its doors for business. It was actually a little fort, kind of part of the American Fur Company trading post. And then as they started to realize it was a good spot, particularly for trade, they built the walls up on this fort. They built adobe walls, bricks, and then it became looking more like this particular picture. And then on Christmas Day in 1850, it officially became Fort Benton. And it was the trader Alexander Culbertson who actually opened this post. Now, the interesting thing about Alexander Culbertson is he was the one who was instrumental in bringing this peace between the Americans and the Blackfoot, because his wife was actually a blood tribe. How would you use it? I don't even know what word I'm using. Not Indian, but from the blood tribe. She was from the blood tribe, and her brother was actually seen from afar. And so she came from a very powerful family. And it was because of that relationship, because his wife was related to all these important Blackfoot people, Blackfoot leaders, that she's the one that actually got them to come and visit her new home, this fort, Fort Benton. So Fort Benton actually became the seat, the capital in Montana Territory for settlement. This was where everybody came to first before they went anyplace else in Montana. The miners came up to Fort Benton, the cowboys, the soldiers, all the people came up to Fort Benton, because by 1862, now you can get to Fort Benton on a steamboat. And that, that changed the dynamic of the trade, because the Hudson Bay Company were still using canoes to get up and down the North Saskatchewan all the way out to the Hudson's Bay. And that's how they moved their furs and moved their trade goods. Well, now the Americans were sending steamboats that could bring up hundreds, if not thousands of people into Fort Benton and ship down thousands and thousands of buffalo robes and pelts into St. Louis for the fur trade. So Fort Benton became the capital of this new area. It was the hub of the whiskey trade. This is where all the warehouses were for the furs, for the whiskey. This is where the saloons and the inns and all of these places that sprung up among this one little town, Fort Benton. So let's move on to the next image. Now, 5 years after Fort Benton was established, there was more and more settlers moving into that particular part of the Missouri, and they wanted more and more land. We had more and more gold prospectors coming into the area, looking for fame, looking for gold. But also, the government was now looking at two possible ways to put their railroad that was going to go across from the East Coast to the West Coast. So the first place that they chose actually would have went right through Blackfoot lands. And in order to secure those lands, they needed to make peace with those natives living in that area first. And those people just happened to be the Siksikaitsitapiiks, or the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. So the Lame Bull Treaty, which was negotiated with the American government in 1855 with the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, this was a legal document. And this is when the United States of America asked permission to share this land with the Blackfoot. And in those negotiations, the Blackfoot were promised 10 years of annuities in order and to allow this train or this area to be opened up for settlement. Well, it turns out the train never did go through there. It went south of the Blackfoot lands, but yet this treaty was already established. But it never did bring peace, not between the Blackfoot and other tribes living on those lands, or authorized by the United States of America for other tribes to be living on those lands when they were in fact, Blackfoot lands. So for the first time in the history of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, we lost land. On paper, maybe not physically, but on paper, we lost land because of this treaty. And for the first time in the history of the Blackfoot people, this agreement that we thought was sacred, that we made with the quote-unquote white people, actually amounted to lies. Because of the 10 years of annuities promised to the Blackfoot, only 2 or 3 years actually arrived to the Blackfoot. And the other 7 years of annuities were all squandered by corrupt Indian agents, American Indian agents. So to the Blackfoot, this treaty didn't amount to anything more than a land grab, and the newcomers were liars. That's what they thought after the end of this treaty. So, interesting enough, this same treaty outlawed liquor on native lands. And interestingly enough, Fort Benton was situated on Blackfoot lands. So by all rights, it shouldn't even have existed. It shouldn't have been there to be able to do that sort of a business. But no one moved them out, and so Fort Benton continued to operate right up until, like, it's still there to this day. But let's actually move on to the next image. So in 1856, another event happened, and that was the 1856 gold rush. Now we had tens of thousands of settlers, prospectors moving into the Fort Benton region. And these people, by their numbers, unlike previous visitors to Blackfoot lands, never asked permission to go onto certain areas, hunting grounds, wintering camps. These people simply moved into a stream or into a river area and started panning for gold, putting up their camps and being disruptive. And in fact, they looked at the Blackfoot as the nuisance or the disruptive force. And so violence ensued. There was a lot of bloodshed that happened between the miners and the Blackfoot. And the whole time, the miners were the ones who were not supposed to be there, even by American law. They weren't supposed to be on those lands. But yet, as happened a lot of times, was the government turned a blind eye to their activity. So in 1856, this gold rush literally brought up tens of thousands of new settlers into Blackfoot lands, especially at our southern border. So as we move on to the next image, as I mentioned, here at Fort Benton in 1862, the steamboats are coming into this town. They're the farthest inland post in the world.
These steamboats could leave the Gulf of Mexico, travel up the Mississippi, travel up the Missouri, and go as far as the Great Falls of the Montana, which is where Fort Benton was, and they could go all the way back down to the Gulf of Mexico, stopping in St. Louis along the way, which was the capital of the fur trade in the United States of America at that time. So because of this traffic, more and more settlers were moving into the Montana territories. And because of this, there were more and more people who weren't obeying protocols when dealing with the Blackfoot people. So a lot of violence ensued, erupted because of this. So let's move on to our next image. Now, there's a big event that happened in 1865. In fact, there's actually a couple of big events that happened in 1865 that affected the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. Now, the first one was the end of the American Civil War. Now, at that time, America was embroiled in this civil war that tore their country apart. And then at the end of that civil war, which was ended in 1865, and you know, if anybody knows the American history, not even long after the end of that Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. While all of this is happening, the American Fur Company decides to sell all of their forts. So the American Fur Company basically ceased to exist after 1865 in the Montana region. So what they did is they sold their forts to a lot of newcomers, to some of their forts to the military after 1865. And at that time, there were more and more homeless settlers moving into the Montana territory to ply their trade at hide hunting, the fur trade, or going into wolf hide hunting, or going into gold prospecting, any way that they could make their fortune, selling whiskey to the natives. And this is actually what happened. After the American Fur Company folded, there was no more controls over the liquor trade. So because of this, the American Fur Company was basically replaced by hundreds of freebooters, hundreds of free traders. And these free traders had no restrictions. All they cared about was making profit. So when they started selling liquor or firewater to the natives, the native tribes in their areas, it wasn't even real whiskey. It wasn't like the high wines that the British and French had sold to the native tribes. This was basically alcohol mixed with water in these huge vats, and they would throw in all sorts of adulterants. They would throw in peppers, Hofstadter bitters, they would throw in ink, they would throw in chewing tobacco. Hundreds of traders with hundreds of different recipes, and a lot of times the recipes were poisonous. Some of our people didn't realize this until they drank the firewater brew that these Americans were making. So this is what kind of happened after the American Fur Company folded in 1865. But let's move on to the next image. Here we see a little bit more of these free traders. And these free traders, they weren't like the British and French. These traders came right out to the Blackfoot camps, and that proved even more disruptive for the Blackfoot people's lifestyle. Because now, we don't know when they're coming. They could be coming into our camps, and in the morning you'll see some of these traders outside of our camps, and they're all selling whiskey. So the young people are bringing their hides to them for this whiskey, and then people are getting drunk. And so there were no controls. And in fact, our chiefs lost a lot of their authority during this time because none of the drunk warriors or people like that cared to listen to any authority, cared to be told what to do. And in fact, the violence and the murder just increased after this time, especially with the Blackfoot trading with the Americans after 1865. So let's move on to the next image. Now, interestingly enough, this picture of this man here, this is a picture of Isaac Baker. Now, I.G. Baker. Now, this person, he came up with the American Fur Company. He actually worked for the American Fur Company. But in 1865, when the American Fur Company folded, he actually brought up his own goods, and then he started to sell his own liquor and his own trade goods to the people in Fort Benton and to the native tribes. And so he became a very wealthy man. In fact, he was one of the first millionaires in the province of Montana, or the state of Montana, I should say. And he outfitted pretty much everybody that came into town. He was a mercantile. He was the grocery store. But a lot of people in history will say that this man didn't want to be involved in the Blackfoot trade. And that's bogus, because of course he did. Because he didn't want to be put out of business by his competitors. So he freely supplied all of these whiskey merchants into going into Blackfoot lands to acquire the pelts that everybody wanted. Because by this time you have to understand the trade. A 35-cent cup of whiskey to make, or so-called whiskey, it equaled a buffalo robe. And that buffalo robe you could sell in St. Louis for $16.50 or $17. So if you do the math, $3.50 worth of liquor, that will net you $170. I mean, today those are huge profits. Can you imagine then? They were incredible profits. Hence the reason why all these people wanted to go out to Blackfoot country to make their fortune. So this is what this man did. He outfitted those people so they could sell more whiskey to get more hides. And when he sold those hides, he made incredible profits. But he wasn't the only man. This man sold whiskey, but if we go to the next image, we actually look at the other person. Now this person's name was Tom Power. Now he was the other man's competitor. He had his own company in Fort Benton, and they had a sort of a friendly rivalry going. They actually backed each other up, helped each other with funds when they needed it, paid each other back, but they were in competition, no doubt. They had hundreds of men working for one man, hundreds of men working for the other man, and each of these groups would go out into Blackfoot country or the surrounding tribes to sell rot-gut whiskey for hides. And they would bring these hides back into Fort Benton, whereas these men had the money and the means to ship those hides down to St. Louis and get their returns on them and continue operating. And so these two men became whiskey merchants, the two biggest whiskey merchants in Fort Benton, and a big influence on the Blackfoot-speaking peoples because of it. So if we move on to the next image, we see that these two men actually controlled the whiskey trade that came to the Blackfoot country from the United States of America. And today, in today's politics, they're not too much different than a lot of people in the United States of America as far as business sense. They didn't care how they made their profits. And the thing is, the Siksikaitsitapiiks were the ones who suffered from their ambitions. So let's move on to the next image. Now, because of all of this whiskey that was freely being poured and going to the Blackfoot camps, and like I said, there was no controls, even the United States government had no control over this. This is a period when they called it the Blackfoot Wars, because so much violence erupted between the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, the Siksikaitsitapiiks, and the Americans, particularly in Fort Benton. The violence was just incredible. There were people being slaughtered, murdered, just going to and from the town. And it wasn't just the Blackfoot who were killing people. The Fort Bentonites themselves were committing all sorts of atrocities. In fact, one of the things that they did is they hung up 4 Blackfoot Indians, or 4 Blackfoot people, from a tree. So people going into the town of Fort Benton would see them. And on these 4 natives was a sign that said, "These are 4 good Indians." Well, when the Blackfoot saw that, that's when Chief Bullshead, who was related to these people, he actually went on his war party, his war rampage, where he burnt down all the government farms and killed some of the herdsmen and some of the people here in the United States of America because of that affront. So this is how bad things had got, and a lot of it was all directly blamed on the whiskey trade. That if this whiskey trade did not exist, uncontrolled as such, that there wouldn't be so much violence. But because it was uncontrolled, the relationship between the Americans, particularly from Fort Benton, and the Blackfoot just went downhill. And this was even after the Lane Bull Treaty in 1855. So let's move on to the next image. Now this is a little bit more about the Blackfoot War. See, these were traders. They would just leave the town of Fort Benton, middle of the night. They'd bring out their whiskey, go trade with the natives under the cover of darkness. And then
maybe the native peoples would get drunk, maybe something bad happened because of this sort of trade. But this was a sort of trade that was happening in the United States of America with the Blackfoot at that time. And the reason why is because the trading of liquor with native tribes in the United States of America was basically illegal, even for their people. To trade liquor with any of the native tribes was against the intercourse law of 1836. And so these Americans from the town of Fort Benton were doing illegal activities because they weren't even supposed to be trading with the native peoples, but yet they were each making their fortunes or small fortunes by doing such as doing this illegal trading. So, like I mentioned, this was all part of this Blackfoot War, the bad feelings and the bad relationship that the Siksikaitsitapiiks had with the Americans at that time, all because of the whiskey trade. So let's move on to the next image. Now, the thing is, the Americans did try to control it somewhat. When they knew that these unlicensed whiskey traders, all these freebooters were flooding the land, they made it illegal, and they brought out their military, and they brought out their U.S. Marshals to stem that trade. They weren't successful in stemming it, but they did stop a lot of people from doing that sort of trade. And one of the ways that they were able to rat on other competitors was to actually license some of these competitors. So they did license 2 companies to trade with the Blackfoot legitimately, no alcohol, but trade goods. And these people were put up near Blackfoot country, up near the Blackfoot, where the Blackfoot were living at that time. And in the meantime, these unlicensed whiskey traders would go out by their hundreds, and usually they intercepted the Blackfoot before the Blackfoot even arrived at these licensed trading posts. And so they would intercept these Blackfoot, get all the furs, and then sell their whiskey, and they really weren't able to stem that whiskey trade. And so even the licensed traders complained to the government that there was no way for them to make a profit because these unlicensed whiskey traders were getting all the profits. And they wouldn't stop because they were making profits off the Blackfoot people. So this whole whiskey trade, there was just simply, even though there were laws from the British and laws from the Americans saying that no one's supposed to be selling liquor to the native tribes, period, it was still getting through to the tribes, all of this illegal liquor. And it was truly devastating. Because during this time from 1865 right up until about 1870 in the United States of America, our people are already starting to suffer from the effects of this whiskey trade. So these unlicensed whiskey traders, as I mentioned, they had no controls at all, and they had no morals. They wanted to make profits. And so they would get their liquor from Fort Benton, and they would make their way into the Blackfoot camps or other tribes, and they would sell their liquor for robes, and they did this continuously. And more often than not, this caused nothing but chaos and misery in the tribes that they just visited with their rot-gut firewater whiskey. So let's move on to the next image. Now, the reason why the Blackfoot traded with the Americans so much was because they offered us more goods. And that was one of the handoffs why the Americans were popular with the Blackfoot, was because they offered more items that the British didn't have. They had things like items, more junk goods, but these are things our people had never seen before. Things like flasks for whiskey, or lighters, or maybe not lighters, but strike light pouches, and all these different types of things that our people have never seen before. Now the Americans, which may be their excess, this is what they're selling to the Blackfoot. And so the Blackfoot would flock to the American whiskey posts in the trading seasons to get all these little curious goods that they were bringing up. They were bringing up the same goods as the British, the Hudson Bay Company, but they were bringing up more. So hence the Blackfoot sort of favoring these different fur companies for trade goods. And all they wanted was buffalo hides, because by this time that was the hide that the white people wanted. And early in the fur trade, the white people wanted the beaver skins. That was because of the fashion industry in Europe, the fur trade. Well, by this time, they were no longer using beaver skins for hats and such. They had felt. What they were using was the buffalo robes, because what they found out was that these buffalo robes make the best fan belts in the world. You treat this
buffalo robe, you cut it into fan belts, and you could run all of those machines that the white man needed for his industrial revolution. Because there was thousands and thousands of machines needing pulleys, needing fan belts, and the buffalo provided the best. And so if people ever wonder what happened to all those tens of millions of buffalo, well, that's what happened to them. The Industrial Revolution turned them all into fan belts. That's what happened to them. And so that's what this predominantly was trade for buffalo hides in exchange for trade goods coming from the American Fur Company, or the American freebooters even. So let's move on to the next image. Now, so let's kind of talk a little bit about the effects of this liquor trade on the Siksikaitsitapiiks. Well, you have to understand at the beginning of this trade, like I mentioned, well, actually, let's go before then. Alcohol was something that my people did not ever know. It wasn't something that was a part of our life. We did not make it. We did not import it from other people. It was simply something we did not know how to make. It was never part of our life. Even the effects of it. These were things that were a mystery to our people when they first started to drink the alcohol, the liquor. And so you'd feel 10 feet tall. You'd feel bigger than you really are. You'd have all these sorts of feelings. And these are the things that our people weren't used to dealing with, especially when it came to intoxicants. So to the Blackfoot people, we never had intoxicants. We never drank intoxicants, not throughout our thousands of years of existence did we ever drink alcohol. And so when it was first introduced to us, we didn't even know what to call it. So our people started to say, napiochki, or the white man's water. And we knew it did something to you. So our people would start to, but even then, we didn't buy it from the British or from the French. They gave it as gifts to entice us to trade. So they'd give us small quantities, enough to make you feel a little different or so, and then we would go in and we would trade. And this lasted for like 100 years or so before it changed. And during this time, when they were enticing the people to come into trade, it was only those people who had power, our chiefs, our older men. These are the ones who would drink the alcohol. The younger people never touched it. And so that's why to the Blackfoot, if an older man were to get drunk and maybe start acting a little bit differently, they could forgive him for it because of his age, because he's old enough to do it. And not everybody was drinking. Maybe you just 30 people out of 500. I don't know. But there wasn't a lot of people drinking during this time when the liquor first came to our people through the British and the French. And then when the Americans started to trade with us, it was sort of the same way, but then things started to change after that. Big time. Because now with the Americans coming right into our camps, it wasn't just left for our older people, our distinguished, or the older people who have the right to be able to sit down and drink this alcohol. Now it was anybody, the young people. People were drinking this, people who had no regard for tomorrow. They started to drink the alcohol, and that changed things because now it wasn't limited to once or 2 times a year visits to the forts. Now it was happening right in our camps daily. And so the violence and the chaos that came with it, this started to infect our people even more and more, particularly from after 1865, right up until 1870 in the United States of America. So during this time, there was a lot of other things that changed. For the first time in our whiskey counts, as winter counts, as Blackfoot people, you start to see those social issues start to arrive during this time. Our people loved our children. We did not abandon our children ever, nor did we abandon family. That was just something that the Blackfoot lifestyle would not afford you to do. But during the times of the alcohol, this is for the first time in our history we start to see things like family violence, like spousal abuse, husbands beating or killing their wives, neglecting or beating your children, killing your best friend, doing things that our people never did before in our entire history as Blackfoot-speaking peoples. Now that's changed because of the alcohol. At first, it was isolated to a few isolated events, but then by time of the American whiskey trade in 1865, these were becoming daily events. And that great unity that united the Siksikaitsitapi tribes, that was our famous strength, One tribe gets in trouble, you got 3 other tribes that will back you up against any of your problems, or neighboring tribes. That was always our famous strength. But come the unity, come the whiskey trade, that unity was gone. Because those tribes that were given to drinking alcohol, while those chiefs of tribes that couldn't trust the chiefs of other tribes that were. And so this unity was gone. And a lot of the enemy tribes took advantage of this. And also a lot of settlers and people wanting to hunt on Blackfoot lands were now doing so because they realized that the Blackfoot, some of them were suffering. Either they were drunk, drinking, or some of them had sold everything they had, that they no longer had the weapons and the horses and the strength that they had to be able to be a threat. So all of these things were happening to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples after 1865, after the American Civil War. And actually, let's move on to the next image. So, like I mentioned, not all the families were given to drinking alcohol. A lot of families stayed away from it. A lot of tribes would not allow it in their camps. A lot of chiefs, like our chief Crowfoot, Isapumaksika, the story goes is that he wouldn't allow alcohol, our people being drunk, in his camp. And so the soldiers or the warriors would keep those people away until they were sober. But as I mentioned, that's what weakened us, because now we couldn't trust one another. And this is what the liquor trade did to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. So all these quarrels, things were starting to amplify. As I mentioned, they were at first isolated events, trading with the British and the French. But by the time 1850, 1865 came along and the Americans were a part of that trade, the violence was daily. Because now we weren't visiting those posts, now those traders were coming into our camps. So let's actually move on to the next image. Now all of this is going to be a part of the next webinar that we have, and that's going to be basically a continuation of the story from here, which is kind of a synopsis of the past episodes we've had regarding the history of Firewater and the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, the Siksikaitsitapiiks. So on that previous map, if we can actually go back to that map, that's how the that's how the whiskey trade, coming from America, coming from the end of the Civil War, 1865, how it's progressed and made its way northward. Because by 1869, a Northwest Fur Company trader, and that was a licensed company, the Northwest Fur Company, they had a trader and his name was John Ripplinger. Now John Ripplinger, who was a licensed trader, was trying to get away from all these unlicensed traders that were closer to Fort Benton, up in the rivers there, towards the Missouri. Well, he decided he wanted to trade with the Blackfoot in pots and pans and legal trade goods closer to the Blackfoot, near their country. So he actually built a post right just kind of near the British possessions, as they called it, but outside of the jurisdiction of the United States of America. And it was because of this post and the amount of Blackfoot that were coming to this post to trade, that the whiskey trade actually moved across the line from the United States of America into the British possessions, as they called it then, which was Blackfoot country. And that trade brought on a whole lot of advancements for our people, but bottom line, that was how we were a part of the creation of the country they call Canada. That was the Blackfoot part, this history to come in the future episodes. So I think today we could actually end there, but as you did see earlier, there were a number of books that were coming down, and I would encourage any of you who are studying this part of Blackfoot history, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of books out there that you can go through. But if you want to get a good, kind of an accurate history based on dates and based on true times and the activities and things that happened at that time, please review the books that you'll see after this. Those are 4 books that you can get in any library, and those will basically fill in the blanks of this story that I've told you today. If you had any questions, please contact us at programs@Blackfoot Crossing for any questions you may have, any suggestions you may have. And I beg you, please, if you do, send some of this emails into us asking these questions. But
other than that, you know, we'll have a future episode coming up in March here, and we'll talk a little bit more about the whoop-up trade. And before we actually get into the end of we have probably 2 more parts coming to this particular series. But the next series is going to be basically when this whiskey trade coming from the United States of America moved into southern Alberta and then ended only with the arrival of those men in red coats, the Northwest Mounted Police. But so with that, anyways, all of you take care of yourselves. Remember, there's a lot of people out there who may not be doing as well as you are, so remember them when it comes time for feeding and clothing and looking after people. But in the meantime, look after yourselves and each other, and I'll see you at the next episode. Kena Matsin.